In the fall of 1888, Whitechapel, London was in the midst of a brutal killing spree, one where Jack the Ripper appeared and disappeared, taking the lives of women with him. You're listening to True Crime of the Historical Kind. This is part 2 of Jack the Ripper, Hidden in Plain Sight. If you missed part 1, make sure to check that episode out first. Back in Whitechapel, it was nearly 1 a.m. when a carter named Louis Deemschutz found Elizabeth Stride's body just inside the gateway. He notified police and soon they found her, laying on her side with her throat slashed. But there were no abdominal mutilations, the signature that had defined the Ripper's earlier attacks. This made them suspect that the attack must have been interrupted. The yard had been busier earlier that night. Neighbors had seen a man with a black bag lingering near the entrance, and horses and wagons passed frequently through the alley. In fact, when the carter discovered her body, he had just turned his pony cart into the yard, perhaps scaring off the killer mid-attack. If that's true, it would explain why Stride was the only victim without mutilations, because the Ripper was interrupted and forced to flee. Though it seems he must have set out to finish what he had started immediately after killing Elizabeth Stride. As the police secured the scene and looked for evidence, another woman was making her way through Aldgate, which is just a 10 or 15-minute walk away. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes was a woman in her 40s. She experienced many of the same difficulties as other women in and out of the streets of Whitechapel, London. She was a mother and relied on the relationship with Thomas Conway for stability. There were periods of separation between them, and she and her family lived in poverty. Like the pattern we've seen play out several times already, alcoholism only deepened the cycle of desperation and put her in precarious situations. Catherine, or Kate as she was called, had been detained by police earlier in the evening for being intoxicated. When she was released, she headed towards Mitre Square, which is just outside of Whitechapel. The last time she was seen alive was around 1:35 a.m. Possibly just minutes later, she was viciously attacked. No one heard or saw anything, and yet, around 1:44 a.m., a city police constable turned onto Mitre Square on his usual beat. The square was dimly lit and bordered by warehouses and offices. In the far corner, near the entrance to Church Passage, his lantern caught the glint of blood. There, lying on her back with her clothes thrown up, was Catherine Eddowes. The policeman later said that when he left the square only 14 minutes earlier, everything had been undisturbed. Whoever had done this had worked with unimaginable speed. He blew his whistle for help, and the police descended on the second scene of the night. They described the attack as heinous. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear, her abdomen lay open, and her left kidney and uterus were removed. Her intestines were placed across her shoulder, and her face had been slashed in a deliberate pattern. Nicked eyelids, a cut down the nose, and a V-shaped incision on each cheek. It was the first of the Ripper murders to take place within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, rather than the Metropolitan Police, setting off rivalries and jurisdictional tension that would plague the investigation from here on. The night became known as the Double Event. When the first killing, that of Elizabeth Stride, appeared unfinished, he seemed to have set off in search of another victim. Within the hour, Elizabeth Eddowes was found brutally mutilated in Mitre Square before he vanished again into the night. Police now had 2 scenes to manage and look for evidence. A possible clue was left on Goulston Street, a bloodied piece of apron suspected to belong to Catherine, leaving the impression that the killer may have stopped to clean his blade, or himself as he fled the scene. Above the apron, a cryptic message had been scrawled on the wall. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Jews being spelled Juwes. The graffiti was ordered to be washed off by Metropolitan Police Commissioner Warren, which has been a very controversial decision, though it was more than likely done to curb more panic and sensationalism. The theories on what it meant is interpreted in a lot of different ways. Was it an expression of frustration from the Jewish community, or intentional scapegoating? or was it just a cryptic message meant to confuse and distract? There was ongoing hostility between Londoners and the immigration of Polish Jewish families seeking refuge from the violent pogroms of Eastern Europe. This led to Jewish communities within London neighborhoods, and many Londoners didn't see them adapting and blamed them for the inequalities they all faced. More on this piece of the puzzle later. Back at the most recent crime scene, as if it wasn't horrifying enough, police were struggling with what to do about the fact that, just like the Dear Boss letter description, an ear was indeed cut, though it's possible it was just incidental. The Dear Boss letter wasn't the only one thought to be from the killer. On the morning of October 1st, within 24 hours after the double event, a postcard arrived at the Central News Agency in London, addressed simply to the boss. It was scrawled in the same red ink and unmistakable hand as the Dear Boss letter that had been sent just a few days earlier. It read, "I was not codding dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again." Yeah, very eerie, and the phrase saucy Jackie might sound odd to us now, but in Victorian slang, saucy meant bold or cheeky, someone who laughed in the face of authority, and Jackie is just a diminutive form of Jack, a playful self-nickname. So when the writer called himself Saucy Jackie, he wasn't just naming himself, he was performing. It was the voice of someone enjoying the game, taunting police and journalists alike. It could be seen as theatrical, like a stage villain stepping into the spotlight. So that tone, the arrogance, is part of why so many historians suspect that the Ripper letters weren't written by the killer at all, but by someone chasing headlines. Police decided to publish the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard. They had hoped perhaps someone would recognize the handwriting or have some knowledge. But it actually just sparked a stream of hoax letters to flood the newspapers and create chaos and confusion, which is a phenomenon that's still common, unfortunately, with high-profile cases, and maybe one of the more perplexing social reactions, like who writes a hoax letter? Anyway, people would claim to know who Jack the Ripper was. Most of the letters were dismissed, though, and it didn't bring them any closer to finding the killer. Whether the postcard truly came from the killer or was a journalist hoping to stoke hysteria has never been proven. There's plenty of speculation both ways. Yes, it would be lucrative for newspapers, but at the same time, modern profiling suggests some serial killers crave notoriety and like to feel involved in the investigation. They enjoy feeling smarter than the police. So even though this was the first major publicized serial killer, it still tracks with what we know of how certain serial killers think and could mean the letters were authentic. Just think of the Zodiac killer. In real time, London now had not 1, not 2 or 3, but 4 bodies, all of mistakable similarities in background. Women in similar circumstances and societal standing killed in the middle of the night by quick attacks where one minute they're alive and the next minute mutilated in the street. It all shows such a particular motive. Londoners felt like these murders were a spreading disease, never knowing who would be next. Then, on November 9th, 1888, London was celebrating the annual Lord Mayor Day. So there were crowds of people in the streets. A man was sent to collect past due rent at 13 Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street, where a small room was rented by a woman named Mary Jane Kelly. When she didn't open the door, he looked through the window, only to find a horrific scene. There was Mary Jane laying on the bed, clearly brutally attacked, and blood was everywhere. This was by far the most gruesome scene of them all. Little was known about Mary Jane Kelly's life, but she told others that she was an Irishwoman born in Limerick. She sang ballads in the streets for pennies. She told friends that she hoped to leave the East End someday and maybe even start over in France. But she was never able to make it out. Her past is unclear, but she may have come to London under the promise of domestic work, but soon ended up in the East End's red light district. So it's possible that she was trafficked to London, where she was a known prostitute. There were a few subtle distinctions between Mary Jane and the other victims. For one, Mary Jane was the youngest, and she was the only one that rented her own room, though she was pretty far behind in rent. Police were called to the scene and once again dejected to find the work of the Ripper. After gathering information, all they could find at first was that she must have brought a man back to her room, then must have been murdered sometime in the early hours of November 9th. Also, unlike the other victims, Mary Jane was killed indoors, giving the depraved individual time to unleash the full extent of his violence. The scene was so awful that even some of the most seasoned police officers were shaken. This would be the only crime scene of the canonical five that London police would photograph, and one of the first in general that began being photographed around this time. Though the pictures wouldn't be widely seen by the public for decades. And just a warning, they are very disturbing. This killing spree clearly has an escalation pattern. Each attack got worse or attempted to be worse, and after each murder, it was believed that it was rock bottom. That was as terrible as it could get. And yet, it just kept getting topped. This is what we call the escalation period of serial killers. They seem to be in a state of frenzy, and they get a little more careless after getting away with other murders, and it emboldens them to feel untouchable. Just like in more recent times, it can usually lead to the capture as they tend to make more mistakes while in this state. So, while the night of the double event seemed to be the serial killer's berserker mode, actually, the murder of Mary Jane Kelly was the peak. As news broke, this of course led to an unfathomable level of hysteria and paranoia. The sheer brutality, the escalation, the taunting letters, it all pointed to something far more disturbing than anything the public had ever seen before. People braced themselves for what atrocities might unfold next. Would the killer begin to move out of Whitechapel to hunt in other neighborhoods? Was the killer ready to attack other classes of women? Or could it be over? As time went on, with an uneasy relief, things seemed to get quiet, though not entirely. Because in 1889, a new series of violent deaths rippled through the East End, murders that echoed the Ripper's brutality, but didn't quite match his method. These became known as the Whitechapel murders, a broader list that the police kept open as they struggled to decide which were truly linked, as some came before the canonical five and some came after. One of the most notable of the Whitechapel murders came in July 1889, when the body of Alice Mackenzie was found in Castle Alley. Her throat and abdomen had been slashed, seemingly the calling card of the Ripper. But these wounds were rougher, less deliberate, and almost hesitant. Police noted the cuts lacked the precision of the earlier Ripper crimes, and they believed her injuries were likely inflicted by someone imitating the murders rather than the same hand. So this seemed to be the work of a copycat, though to the public, those distinctions did little to ease their anxieties. Between 1888 and 1891, there were 11 Whitechapel murders, but only 5, the canonical 5, are now widely believed to be the true victims of Jack the Ripper. Do we know whether this is accurate or not? No, and as a woman living during this time, did it really matter? If anything, you just knew there were multiple monsters out there. By that point, London's terror had turned to exhaustion, and the city had no choice but to carry on. So, what happened to Jack the Ripper? Did he die? Was he imprisoned for another crime? Did he flee? Or did he simply disappear back into the fold of the community, hiding in plain sight? Even with the killings seemingly to be over, there was still a lot of pressure on the police to produce answers. Following the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, Queen Victoria showed her own frustration by the police's inability to catch the killer. She sent this telegraph chastising the Prime Minister from Kensington Palace. She wrote, "This new, most ghastly murder shows the absolute necessity of some very decided action. All these courts, the narrow streets of Whitechapel in East London, must be lit and our detectives improved." Yet, beyond chastising him, she did not take any other direct action. As for the investigation, the police conducted over 2,000 interviews, followed hundreds of leads, had 100 suspects, yet they could not find any definitive proof, though they did have their own theories. In 1894, 6 years after the last murder, public memory had faded a little, but inside Scotland Yard, the question of Jack the Ripper was haunting the police. Sir Melville Macnaghten drafted what he called a private memorandum. It wasn't meant for the public. Perhaps it was kind of an internal note, a record of what senior detectives believed might be the truth. In it, Macnaghten listed 3 men he considered the most likely suspects: Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, and Michael Ostrog. What's striking is just how uncertain even the memorandum sounds. It's full of cautious language, like believed to be or strongly suspected and said to be insane. There was no conclusive evidence, just guesses and rumors. Macnaghten's notes would stay hidden for decades, yet we'll look into each suspect. The first name on Macnaghten's list was Montague John Druitt. Druitt was born in 1857 in Dorset into a respectable middle-class family. His father was a surgeon, and he followed a similar path of discipline and education. He studied at Winchester College and later Oxford, eventually becoming both a barrister and a schoolteacher at a boarding school in Blackheath, South London. On the surface, he seemed the very picture of respectability, but in late 1888, just weeks after the last Ripper murder, Druitt was suddenly dismissed from his teaching post. The reasons were never made public. Some accounts hint at serious trouble, possibly involving scandal or mental instability. Others suggest he may have suffered from depression. Not long after his dismissal on December 31st, 1888, his body was pulled from the River Thames. In his pocket, police found a return train ticket and a note that read, "Since Friday, I felt that I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me is to die." So it appears to be a suicide. Yet the timing was what put Druitt on police's radar. His death fell just after the final canonical murder of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888, leading some to wonder if the killings had stopped because the murderer had taken his own life. But this was more of a retrospective view. There's no evidence that the public or press suspected him while he was alive. His name only surfaced in Macnaghten's notes. There were a few profiles they believed the Ripper must have fit, that Druitt could have matched, like being the son of a surgeon and being described as, quote, sexually insane, which is a vague Victorian phrase that could mean almost anything. So lining these things up in hindsight probably appears to be connecting dots when in reality it's more of a reconstruction. Because let's not forget, no evidence ever placed him in Whitechapel, and the entire theory rests on coincidence and conjecture. The next name on the list was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant who had settled in the East End during the early 1880s. One of the thousands who fled anti-Jewish violence and economic hardship in Russia-controlled Poland. He worked as a barber or hairdresser, which maybe reminded people of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. Kosminski lived in the heart of Whitechapel, right amid the narrow lanes and lodging houses where the murders took place. It would make sense for the killer to be a local, someone who knew the rhythms of the streets and back alleys to disappear into. Macnaghten described him as a Polish Jew and resident of Whitechapel, a man with great hatred of women, with strong homicidal tendencies. That may have been because by the 1890s, Kosminski's mental health had deteriorated. Neighbors reported strange behavior, paranoid mutterings, refusal to eat food prepared by others, and an obsession with purity that bordered on delusion. In 1891, he was taken to the Colney Hatch Asylum, diagnosed with what we would now call paranoid schizophrenia. He lived out the rest of his life in institutions, dying there in 1919. The timeline could track, except Kosminski wasn't institutionalized until 2 years after the final canonical 5 murder. Decades later, a handwritten note known as the Swanson Marginalia, scrawled in the margins of a retired detective's memoir, added a cryptic layer to the story. It claimed that Kosminski had been identified by a witness, but could not be charged because the witness refused to testify against a fellow Jew. It's a tantalizing detail, but historians disagree on whether it refers to Aaron Kosminski at all, or if it was confused with another suspect entirely. So, again, no direct evidence tying him to any of the crime scenes, unless you believe the modern theory that his DNA was left on Catherine Eddowes' shawl, but more on that later. The third suspect on McNaughton's list was Michael Ostrom, a Russian immigrant with a long criminal record. He was known as a swindler, perpetrating frauds and scams all around town. He used costumes and aliases and was an all-around mysterious man. He was constantly spreading lies about himself. One of his favorites was that he was a surgeon in the Russian Navy, though this was a complete fabrication. So, perhaps to the police force desperate for answers, a foreigner with a supposed surgical background and a long history of deceit seemed to fit the Ripper's profile in their eyes. But no proof that he harmed anyone, and later records would even show that he was imprisoned in France during most of the Whitechapel murders, effectively ruling him out. So, even if Ostrog was a criminal, it doesn't mean he was a murderer. It's more of a reminder of just how far the police were reaching. A man who was known as being a killer may have seemed a better fit. In 1902, a Polish immigrant named George Chapman, born Severin Kłosowski, was arrested for poisoning 3 of his wives, though not all of them were his legal wives. Obviously, his crime showed a chilling disregard for life, especially for women. He had trained in Poland as a feldsher, or a junior surgeon, and he lived right in Whitechapel during the Ripper murders. He clearly had violent tendencies and was misogynistic to women. That, along with being trained as a junior surgeon, has made people question whether this could be Jack the Ripper. But here's the thing. Poisoning is a very different form of murder. People who poison typically have particular motives. The Ripper's kills were brutal, up-close physical attacks that took body parts from the victims. Poisoners tend to kill from a distance and might even relish watching the slow demise and the power they feel, versus what we know the Ripper to be, probably more of a product killer, a person who might not even enjoy the killing portion as much as they like the results, and ultimately find sexual gratification from the body parts that they take from their victims. Though the letters might contradict that slightly, as they said that they enjoyed the killings. Of course, it varies, but this form of sexual deviancy is what we would associate with serial killers like John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Ultimately, Kłosowski was brought to justice for his poisonings, not for the Ripper murders, but he was executed for killing his wives. And no evidence connecting him directly to Jack the Ripper. Another suspicious person was Francis Tumblety, who was just a weird man. He was an Irish American that masqueraded as a doctor, a quack, so to speak. He appeared to have earned a small fortune by posing as an Indian herb doctor. He was an eccentric self-promoter who was often in trouble with the law. He grew up roaming the American countryside selling things like Indian root pills and other strange products, some of which carried mercury, and he was connected to the death of one of his patients, but he was able to escape prosecution. You could say he was a strange, outrageous person who seemed to really enjoy the attention of others by shocking them. He paraded his so-called wealth, though he was arrested in 1881 in New Orleans for pickpocketing. There's even a rumor that he had once been arrested in connection with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, because police believed he was an associate of David Harrod, who was captured with John Wilkes Booth. Another rumor that's more relative to our story is that he held an all-male dinner party where he allegedly displayed a collection of human uteruses preserved in jars and bragged that they came from every class of women. Tumblety hated women, especially prostitutes, and he blamed his misogyny on a failed marriage to a prostitute. He had visited Europe several times and may have even moved to Liverpool in 1874. Offering herbal elixirs and posing as a doctor. Yet he can be placed in Whitechapel around the time of the murders because he was arrested on November 7th in 1888 for gross indecency in Whitechapel. There is record of him leaving to France November 20th in 1888 under the name Frank Townsend. On November 24th of that same year, he returned to America, just days after the abrupt end to the murder spree. The timeline is suspicious, to say the least, but there's more. There was a woman who shared with police that she had a lodger on Batty Street, which, if you look on a map, is about a 10-15 minute walk to each murder location. She claimed that she found a bloody t shirt in the lodge while he was staying there. According to her, the day after the last Ripper murder, he left. The next lodger said that he found a doctor's bag, which contained herbal medicine, clothes, and pornography that Tumblety was known for selling. When Francis Tumblety returned to America, the American press had no trouble convicting him in the eyes of the public, and many believed that he was indeed the killer. He claims he was mistaken as Jack the Ripper because he was American, and there were rumors going around that the killer was American, so he says he was falsely named. This is complete speculation, but there is a claim that Tumblety's only possession at death was a brass ring, similar to the one missing from Annie Chapman. That could be a strange coincidence or completely made up, but it's never been verified. When you look at all the circumstantial evidence here, he seems to have all the ingredients, but still no definitive proof. Over the decades, the Ripper case has been rehashed and rehashed. There is even a huge network of people dedicated to the details and discovery of all things Jack the Ripper, called Ripperologists. It seems like each generation takes in the information and digests it to reflect what they deem important in solving this mega mystery. A large contribution to this is when Macnaghten's daughter, Lady Aberconway, sent in the Macnaghten Memorandum to a journalist in 1959, though they weren't made public until the 1970s. This case has just the right combinations of an overwhelming amount of information or clues, but very little factual evidence. The level of depravity was unheard of, and with the ability of newspapers to spread information, both fact and fiction, has taken this to the highest levels of infamy. By the 1970s, new conspiracy theories emerged, most famously in Stephen Knight's Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution. In it, there are claims that Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, had somehow been entangled in the murders. The story went that Albert Victor, who was rumored to frequent brothels, had fathered a child with a woman in Whitechapel. When she and her friends supposedly tried to blackmail the royal family, the Freemasons, who are a secretive brotherhood of powerful men that can span parliament, aristocracy, and the police, were said to have stepped in to silence them. After Catherine Eddowes' murder, remember that strange message that was found in chalk? The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, with Jews being spelled Juwes. Some claimed that the Jews was referred to the three mythical Masonic ruffians, Jubela, Jubello, and Jubilum, a supposed clue left by a Masonic killer. But historians note that Jews spelled in that way isn't found in any genuine Masonic texts. In truth, this theory rests on speculation and later invention. A Victorian morality tale of class, secrecy, and fear. But it is telling of how the public will always try to make sense of the senseless. There is yet another theory, one that's more recent. It centers on Charles Cross. Do you remember him? I mentioned him back in part 1. He was the man who discovered the first victim, Mary Ann Nichols. If you'll recall, Nichols was found on Bucks Row in the early hours of the morning. Robert Paul came upon Charles Cross standing near her body. The two men checked for signs of life, then went to find a constable. They met one, told him what they'd found, and continued on their way, unaware that by the time the officer arrived, another police officer had already discovered the body, as the blood had begun to pool, showing that this was probably very recent. At the time, Cross seemed like a cooperative witness, but with hindsight, some things might not add up. When police later recorded his statement, they learned that Charles Cross wasn't even his real name. His true name was Charles Lechmere, a local delivery driver who lived and worked right in the heart of Whitechapel. And when modern researchers mapped out the murder sites and the times of the killings, something eerie began to appear. The murders followed the same route that Lechmere would have taken each morning on his way to work. The two that weren't on his direct route were on the way to his mother and daughter's house. Critics argue that plenty of Londoners pass through these same streets, But supporters of this theory note that the near perfect alignment between Lechmere's daily path and the Ripper's map is hard to ignore. The hang-up with this theory is that the killings stopped as suddenly as they began. So could a murderer who still lived in the area just simply stop? Charles Lechmere lived until 1920 and wasn't considered a suspect. Could the Ripper have been hiding in plain sight all along? In recent years, legal teams and forensic experts have asked the question, if suspects thought to be Jack the Ripper were tried today, could they be convicted? Several academic exercises and mock trials have revisited the 1888 evidence, comparing it with today's standards of court proceedings. And each time, the verdict is the same. There's just not enough evidence. The only exception would be magically finding DNA. And you may have seen this for yourself, but there seems to be waves of headlines and posts that claim that the Ripper's identity has been 100% revealed. That is because in the year 2014, an author named Russell Edwards claimed in his book, Naming Jack the Ripper, to have proved Kosminski was guilty. In 2007, he bought a shawl which he believed to have been the same one left at the murder scene and gave it to a biochemist for DNA analysis, which showed there was a hit. The mitochondrial DNA could connect those related to Aaron Kosminski. But there are several red flags here, and scientists from Innsbruck Medical University agree. They criticize the paper and its conclusions because there were mistakes and assumptions made by the authors. This was printed in their response, Expressions of Concern, that pointed out the issues of contamination, the questionable chain of custody on the shawl, and the real limitations of mitochondrial DNA, meaning that mitochondrial DNA could be linked to thousands of people. So while Kosminski remains one of the most frequently named suspects on the internet today, the truth is far murkier. What we do know is that the mystery remains. Jack the Ripper's identity is not confirmed. What experts have been able to identify is the possible profile for this killer. Most seem to agree that this is a product killer and a loner, so his job probably was something that he could do on his own. And because he was so good at evasion, he more than likely knew Whitechapel well and would be a local. So where does this leave us? After all the theories, the suspects, the gruesome details, and the historical context, we're still confronted with the haunting uncertainty. What we do know is that these women were not just victims of a monstrous killer. They were victims of a system that failed them on so many levels. As for Jack himself, whoever he was, became a symbol of something larger than himself. He became a boogeyman, a terrifying embodiment of the hidden dangers lurking in the shadows of Victorian England. This was true crime of the historical kind. If you feel so inclined, leaving a review or sharing this podcast with someone who you think might like it would be so helpful. Until next time, bye.